Good morning. Good morning, everyone that has joined us today for our session, where we are going to be having conversations, interacting, probing and prodding one another in this session. So my name is Wambui Karanja. I'm a co-founder at TWIFund. I'm also a co-chair of Catalyst Now, the Kenyan chapter, and I really want to warmly welcome all of you for taking this afternoon to spend time with us. So I'd like to begin with, to just ground this conversation. And I would want us to consider the fact that our organizations, whether Africa-based, whether out of Africa-based as a collaborator, as a partner, that our organizations are not waiting to be rescued. So I'd like us to start with that kind of grounding. We are not waiting to be rescued. We have always built from what we have, since inception to date, and we continue to do that. And our resourcefulness is not a coping mechanism, even if sometimes people do feel like the resourcefulness is for coping, but it is really a form of intelligence. So as we start, let us think about that. We're not waiting to be rescued. As we discuss grants, as we discuss alternative funding, it is not a cry of help. It is because of the resourcefulness that we have been able to build upon. So today's conversation is not going to be about surviving scarcity. It is about reauthority of possibility. So we are reauthoring what is possible. We are discussing and looking at perspectives of what is possible. From my organization, TWIFund, we serve and work with over 200 organizations across Kenya and Rwanda. And one of the things that has come out over the 3 years that we have been in operation very clearly is that our most underfunded resource is imagination. So it is not what we are doing, it is imagination. So let's have those conversations. So today we are not asking what is missing. That is the hope, that we will not be dwelling on what is missing, but we're going to think about what already exists within our organizations, within us, and we have not been able to name as valuable. So that is how I would want to grant this. I'm going to be moderating this session with all of you today, and it gives me a lot of pleasure. Yeah, so we can now breathe and go to it. So in the chat room, for all of us, I would ask that you all get into the chat and indicate one thing that your organization, or whether you're here in your capacity as an individual who wants to learn, you have an interest in this space. So one thing that your organization or you as a person does exceptionally well, but is rarely or never gets highlighted in any funding conversations. So just take a few minutes and just, put that in the chat box. One thing that your organization does exceptionally well, or you as an individual, but it never comes up in funding conversations, or it's never highlighted. So we'll just take a few minutes in the chat room. On my end, I don't know, I cannot see any movement on the chat. I don't know whether it's just me. I'm hoping to see some conversation going on there. And also still on the chat, again, as we describe the funding landscape, let's describe it in a way of possibility. So instead of thinking of difficulty, can we think of, transformation? So we would say that it is difficult, but think about words that can replace our possibilities. That would also be going on the chat. I know we will have people who will be looking at the chat box. So even as we do that, thank you from Rose. Yeah, strengthening the ecosystem is one thing. Thank you, Jockey. Her strength lies in identifying gaps Eric Onyango from Papamali, Africa, centering local leadership and clamoring for localization and decolonizing aid. So keep them going. One thing that your organization does well, and it doesn't feature in funding conversations. Also, feel free to drop those adjectives that lean towards possibilities as opposed to, they reflect possibilities. So instead of difficulty, transformation. And as we do that, we'll just keep looking at that. I'll just mention just a few more that are coming up. Thank you for engaging. Simeon says communicating solutions for food security. Charity says bringing together people from different walks of life. These are things that we do very well, and they somehow do not have a space in our funding or fundraising conversations. Thank you. So just keep them coming. I know we will revisit them in the conversation. So they will have a role to play as we continue. Thank you, Ruben. Education as a foundation for cross-sectoral transformation. So today we are moving beyond grants into models of sustainability that are rooted in trust, collaboration, performance, and African designed logic. And I would want to take this opportunity first to really appreciate our speakers, our panelists who are going to take us through the different themes as we move on. I also would want to mention that we are not prescriptive. What you're going to listen to our speakers and our panelists is not a prescription to the problems. It is a belief that the conversations we have today are going to inspire us to look at things in a different perspective from where we sit. So there is no solution. We don't come with solutions, but we want to have an interaction together. So you will see me throwing you into the chat, asking you to interact and to have a really good conversations. So let me take this opportunity to introduce Rose Maruru, who is going to be a panelist. Thank you very much, Rose. Rose Maruru is a co-founder and CEO of Epic Africa. She is not new in this space. She has easily 30 years experience in global development and very passionate about growing our organizations. And you will see more about that as you interact with her. She has led and advised organizations like Trust Africa, Oxfam International Population Council, Save the Children, ADB, and she serves on boards of Firelight Foundation, Giving and Giving Tuesday. Firelight Foundation and Giving Tuesday. And I want to welcome very much, especially in her role as the co-founder and CEO of Epic Africa. She will talk about that. I also would want to introduce Ezine Anyanu. Ezine leads partnership development at Instiglio, Africa, where she advances performance-driven governance across 30 plus countries. Her day-to-day is an intersection between public systems, financing, and accountability. She also serves on the board of West African Academy of Public Health. Thank you so much, Ezine, for lending us your time and your expertise. Welcome. I also want to introduce Holly Lippett. Holly is an associate partner at Instiglio. And for her focus is on resource-based financing models that unlock capital and strengthen accountability for African social enterprises and NGOs. A very important conversation to have. Finance models, unlocking capital and strengthening accountability. Some of the areas that are sometimes a challenge for our organizations. She has also led a operational strategy at One Acre Fund in the past. And last but certainly not least, I don't know whether Holly is there, maybe you can also bring her on. And then we have Steve Kariuki. He's an executive director at Majina Ufanisi. and has led WASH and community development programs with UN Habitat, UNHCR, DFID, and CEDA. Those are the big boys and the big girls when we come to grants and, so we have an expert in the room. He has reached and impacted over 10 million people directly. I think the numbers indirectly cannot even be counted, the ripple effect. He pioneered the award-winning WASH model that creates livelihoods for youth and women. So when you think about WASH, some of us have interacted with WASH just recently. Some of us still don't know what is WASH. They think it's the literal washing. Steve is going to open up that more for us. And more importantly is marginal financing, an organization that has been around for I believe over 10 years. I believe so. And why I would want to amplify marginal financing is that he will be able to walk us through what it means to have a shift to employ a model from donor to enterprise. So those are our speakers and panelists for today. I welcome you all once again. Thank you very much. So this is now your space, our panelists. So karibu sana. So I'll start by saying that each of you, you represent a different doorway into sustainability. I hope I have been able to bring that out in the introduction. Different doors, different avenues. The narrative, community enterprise, financial innovation, and a systemic reform. So I want us to, let's start with a little bit, a story of authorship, how we put ourselves out there as the organizations that are represented in this call. So I would maybe start with you, Rose, where I would maybe pose a question that you can open up for our attendees. So if African civil society, and allow us to use civil society to represent organizations that would also go beyond the book definition of civil society. So let's think NGOs, let's think CBOs, let's think the civil society as well. Let's think about for-profit impact organizations, for example, like where Tree Fund falls in. Let's even think about NGOs and individuals who maybe operate their entities as sole proprietorships, but they are still impacting, the society. So if this society were rewriting its own funding story, where would we begin, from your experience at EPIC Africa, where you have been able to map over 3,000 organizations onto a platform? Where would you recommend the rewrite of the funding story to begin? And would you see from that rewriting, do you think we can be able to see alternative funding logics quietly emerging, from what we already know? If we allow ourselves, if we give ourselves the permission to do that. So speak about that. Where should organizations look internally, for sustainability routes? So I want to open that for you, Rose. The floor is yours. I'll give you about 10 minutes. Let me see if I can figure out a timer.
Okay.
But yes, 10 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Wambui, and hi to all my co-panelists, and welcome to everyone else. Oh, that's a big question. So as a way to begin to answer it, maybe I can start with just a little, like, why do we exist as EPIC Africa and what do we do? And then I'll tie to more directly to your questions. So as one boy said, I've been around for a while. I don't want to date myself, but for a while, working both on in so-called global development, working for international NGOs, working for African organizations, both as, a grant maker as well as a grant seeker. So I've been on both sides. But what really led or motivated the setting up of EPIC Africa, and EPIC stands for Enhancing Philanthropic Impact. And what really spurred the founding of this organization was just that cumulative lived experience of observing this space. And if you think of it as a market, it's a space that's very dysfunctional in terms of asymmetries of information, huge barriers to entry. If you're a new organization that has some amazing ideas, how do you break through and get funding? And what another observation was that again, we're interacting a lot with sort of external funders, which I, talk about the problems with that. And what we often heard was that, it's very difficult to find, African organizations, and even when you find them, how can you trust them, et cetera, et cetera. And so the predominant way that supporters, funders specifically, would connect to or find local organizations is through asking around to people who are like them, who they trust. And so what ends up happening is the same, 6 degrees of separation. I probably know the same 6 people Wambui knows. And so you end up with this, again, very dysfunctional space where there's also kind of a few organizations dominate the space. And yet, again, in the experience, there's thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of local efforts, small, all the way from the ground. But because we somehow are trained or look at the space with lenses from outside, so we look at ourselves from other people's lenses, and we're looking for something that looks like what it looks over there. So we miss to see actually what's happening right in front of our eyes. We deny our own reality. And for most of us that, have grown up in Africa, we know about Harambe and Ubuntu and all of those things. In Kenya, I mean, a lot of people went to school because a community came together and put money together, right? And sent them for higher education. So we know that we've always been at the forefront, the actual architects and drivers of our own development. And we fund it in whatever ways we do that. And one thing that strikes me, again, if you think, for example, about the official, by official, it's mostly World Bank type of data about poverty in our countries, you would imagine, half of the population sleeps out on the street because who lives on, is it $2 a day now? So where are those people? If I lose my job today and I have nothing, I'm going to go to my sister's house. So, I'm going to go to my friend. One boy will put me up and feed me and, give me bus fare to go and look for a job. But that's never counted, right? That's completely discounted as a contribution. But if you're in the West and you lose a job, your government writes you a check and they count that, right? So I think we really need to rethink how we think about this thing called development. And that's where data and knowledge for us is so crucial. Like, what is actually happening? And so we've been, since our setting up in 2017, really focusing on growing data and knowledge about African civil society organizations. Who are they? Where are they? What do they do? To what end? How are they funded? Et cetera, and also looking at, what's the environment, surrounding these organizations in terms of, laws and regulations, ease of moving money, ease of giving. Like, if I want to send, if I want to send 100 shillings to an organization in my neighborhood, my village, how do I get that money to them? So there are all these kinds of, barriers that exist. So we really trying to really raise the visibility or bring the visibility of this incredible effort that Africans are doing everywhere, but with often little support from the regulatory point of view, and little visible structured support from Africans themselves. And if you think about it, I mean, I often like to when I talk to younger people and today on the continent, it's clear to me that we haven't been great. Our sector hasn't been very great at documenting and sharing, and you could call them stories, so that many young people don't actually know that the freedoms that we enjoy today and despite the non-freedoms, we do enjoy many freedoms today compared to, decades ago. And it's because of civic action. It's people who came together, it's individuals, some died, were killed, so that today we can, speak our minds and we can enjoy freedom and we can have access to, services that before were not available. So we believe that data can be very, very empowering empowering to the sector to demand, say from their government, more enabling regulations. Because if you think of the work that CSOs do, for example, filling gaps where government is not reaching, running schools, food, healthcare, et cetera. And yet that's government's responsibility. So what should be the relationship? Shouldn't government even be funding organizations that are delivering services, because that's their job? So I think, but we don't have data, and oftentimes I find that when we start to speak, for example, to government about enabling environment and these sorts of conversations, oftentimes, they'll ask, and sometimes they're being disingenuous, of course, but what does your sector do? Like, what's your collective, what difference are you making? And I can tell them about how wonderful Epic Africa is and all the difference we're making. But we're really able to say, okay, in Kenya today, Mr. whatever, in Senegal, where I live, Mr. Minister of Finance, the reason you should not tax us is because, listen, 2 million children would not be going to school if it wasn't for the sector, or accessing water, which is what Steve is doing, et cetera, et cetera. So really being able to have data, aggregate it, we believe that can be a powerful advocacy tool. It's also a powerful advocacy tool with our own citizens. Why should they support us? Why should Kenyans, individuals, support Epic Africa or any other organization? So being able to show and to tell our people, what is it that we do and what difference are we making? But unfortunately, our accountability has often been towards our donors, especially the external ones, and not inside. But the good news, as Wambui said, let's not talk about what there isn't. What there is, and which is so amazing, is our research is showing us that actually individual Africans, ordinary African individuals, are a top source of funding for, at least according to our samples, 65% of respondents say that, and this is consistent across several surveys that we've carried out, that ordinary individuals, are among the top 3 sources of funding for a majority, for 65% of organizations that we have surveyed. So this is really good news, and what we need now is, how can we understand that phenomena a little bit better? So how can more CSOs be able to tap into this local generosity? And we all know that we're generous, we support each other, we have, there are all these African-rooted giving and solidarity and caring for, or being your brother's or your sister's keeper. And that, how do we translate that into now supporting organizations that are moving an agenda that would impact large numbers of people? So again, just another example, I think most of us, every end of month, you're sending money to someone, so, and it could be in the family, it could be, the larger family, to support those people. And often it's around health, medical bills, school fees and things like that. And this is continuous, right? So sometimes I wonder, how do we become more strategic? So if I keep paying hospital bill, if I know of an organization, okay, last one, yeah. If I know of an organization that is fighting for universal, healthcare, that's fighting for universal education, if those organizations and that movement was successful, I wouldn't have to be chalking, 10,000 Kenya shillings every month to buy all these things. So it's also thinking, how do we, this generosity of ours, how do we push it to the next level. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Rose. And I mean, I'm hearing about sustainability and sustainability for organizations, especially as we rethink funding, because I mean, funding is quite important. We can't move without that resource. So from Rose, I hear the power of aggregated data. So as we keep the conversation going, can we think about the massive amount of data as organizations in the impact space, the amount of data that you have? Are you aggregating it internally, for yourself? And even if you're aggregating it and using it externally, remember there is also the regulation that comes with management of data. Are you shying away from that, or how are you working with that? Because it's true, ultimately, partners will ask you, can you back up what you're saying? Yes, there is need for grassroots intervention, but what does that look like at the end? And the church is doing it, is in the family doing that. So I hear that sustainability begins with recognition. And you first have to recognize the work that you're doing before we seek, unfortunately, we seek a lot of external validation. Our stories are told external to us. So can we first recognize? It begins with recognition before revenue. And I know Steve is going to talk about that aspect. I know Holly will touch on the revenue aspect. So another thing is what I said, there is a lot of philanthropy in Africa. The latest research was actually putting our countries highest in terms of generosity. Even countries that are in Africa that are going through such difficult strife right now, still made it in the highest metrics in terms of giving. So we ourselves are philanthropists. It's just that it's not measured. But do we need for external measurement to be done? Why are we not measuring it and inspiring more giving? So I would now want us to shift to one of the most practical and courageous pivots, which is earned revenue. And I would then now go to Steve. As Steve begins to talk, take the opportunity to talk about maji na ufanisi more. And you'll also be having 10 minutes also. And these are some of the questions that I would want you to address. For all of us, the audience and the guests, I also want you to notice that my questions are very, very realistic. I'm consciously and deliberately avoiding the jargon that we normally encounter, we all know the philanthropy space that has got all these many words. So I really want to go to a very relatable level. So for you, Steve, what emotions surfaced, in the organization to you, even for you, when you first considered earned revenue? Marginal ufanisi, we were running on grants. Now you were getting into a revenue-based model. What emotions, were elicited from that consideration? And again, what has earned revenue allowed you to do that grants could not? And that is particularly important because we tie ourselves to grants so much, we normally get blinded by what we can do if we pivoted, if we brought in, a cocktail, different ways of generating revenues, and what guardrails helped protect your mission identity. Because again, revenue starts streaming in, so maybe you are on grants and you are awash. Now you have created an entity that is bringing in earned revenue. So what guardrails did Maji na Ufanisi put up that really protected the mission to still stay to, wash? So over to you, and you have 10 minutes. Thank you. You need to unmute.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you, my co-presenters and the participants which are in the meeting room. I have a pleasure and honor to be here today. just to showcase the kind of work that we've done. Margin of unease actually has been in existence for the last 28 years. And we basically are an offshoot of what used to be WaterAid UK. So when WaterAid UK was pulling out of Kenya for strategic reasons, the staff who are part of the programs that were being implemented by WaterAid UK requested WaterAid UK to continue with the programs. And then WaterAid was generous enough to accept that request. And on the condition that then you register and form a local organization that will take over. So that's how Margin of unease came into being. And it was registered as Water and Development, but it was the general feeling from WaterAid UK that Water and Development and WaterAid UK looked a bit synonymous. So we were Margie then was made to then change and start using the Swahili version of Water and Development. So we normally use Margin of unease, which is the translations of Water and Development. Since then, obviously, at that time, we relied so heavily on donor support, mostly from Western, the Western Hemisphere, what we call the North. A lot of it from Europe, the Scandinavian countries, and that supported the operations of Manji for the next 10 years until around 2007, when the fortune started and the things started changing. Kenya was actually being considered as a middle-income country, and the grants started reducing in terms of the volumes that were coming. Having stated that, this is a local organization with a local board of directors, and therefore attracting funding, especially when you don't have maybe outsiders or board like the ones at the INGOs, sometimes can be a bit tricky. But our work, the need and the felt need for our work in terms of water, sanitation, and hygiene was quite needed. Our services as an organization were quite needed. And just to mention that we operate from both arid and semi-arid lands. We have some programs in arid and semi-arid lands, specifically for those places because they have unique challenges, especially on water. We also have rural programs. Again, they have different challenges as far as water and sanitation is concerned. And also we have the urban wash, which is a bit more challenging considering the populations and the people, most of the people living in the informal settlements. So having steered Margie through these shifting landscapes, I think my perspective on sustainability and the fundament have been fundamentally rewritten. It is a journey that was from a narrow technical focus to a broader, more resilient system review. And if I was to distill the evolution, then we started from an engineering model of sustainability, which was more or less at the hardware phase. Asking ourselves, water pumps, we did trust for 10 years. Have we trained the water user committee on basic maintenance so that they're able to maintain? Is the tariffs that we are charging for the services, for example, for the water, for the water, enough to cover the repairs? Those were the questions that we're asking. So our model was more of secure the grant, implement the hardware, whether it's a borehole or a water facility or school wash rehabilitation, and hope it lasts. We didn't think about the people, issues of governance, the financial systems. Those were basically an afterthought, a box to be ticked. And we saw communities as beneficiaries, not as parties. That in itself, of course, has had its own challenges. But of course, we had the hard lessons in terms of the funding. The donors started shifting, as I mentioned. The priorities moved from pure infrastructure to good governance, climate resilience, system strengthening. Those are buzzwords, as Wambui has been talking about. They keep on evolving. They always come up with something. Yeah. And more critically, so projects fail. We have seen, we can't sit here and say we haven't seen projects fail. We have seen them, many of them fail. Some of them that we have implemented, some of them which have been implemented by our peer partners. And therefore, it could have been caused by many issues. Maybe the committee treasurer embezzled the funds. There's a political leader during campaigns promised free water or free, sanitation services, free borehole. And there are issues of climate shock, like the prolonged droughts in the places that we are. And the communities never felt that it was their asset to begin with. There was no sense of ownership at the community level. And this is a painful and necessary education that we have gone through. And we realize the hardest part of sustainability is technology. It is the human and institutional ecosystem around it. And today, for me, sustainability is multi-layered, it's a multi-layered and interconnected concept. In itself, sustainability is not a destination. It is where you reach a project completion. It's very dynamic. And you look at sustainability, financial stability beyond tariffs. You don't look at financial sustainability just as the tariffs. It is beyond. Of course, user tariffs are crucial for the operations and maintenance, but we have to think bigger. We hope communities and government explore blended financial models so that it's not just the tariffs, but can we have other financial models that can supplement to the tariffs? Can the water facility that we have installed somewhere, for example, have other services? And in this case, like we have now wash facilities that we have been working on, where you have even the shoe shiners, we have a shop, we have so that community, apart from selling the wash services, they're able also to generate revenue from different sources, because that facility is at a prime area. The human traffic is always very high, and therefore those services will be needed by the communities. We have to think about, we then started seeing ourselves now in the shift as facilitators. Marginal Fanisi started looking at ourselves as facilitators, not just the builders of the infrastructure, as the way we've been looked at previously during the grants and relying on grants. Then we thought about how do we institutionalize and the institutional and governance sustainability was paramount. Yeah, invest more in building transparent and accountable management structures. For example, you professionalize water management so that you don't have the facilities that we are putting up managed by volunteer committees. We need committees which are formal, they are legal, they have bank accounts, for example, they have business plans that they follow, so that the running of that facility or that infrastructure is professionalized. And therefore, we need to even ask them, how much profit have you earned, from the revenue that you have generated at a particular period of time, maybe a month or even a quarter. So that, and the records, you keep the records of the number of people you are serving. You make sure that those facilities, for them to attract customers, then you have they are maintained properly. They are washed, they are cleaned, and they are serviced properly. Then obviously we looked at the deepening the local ownership, so that from the very first day, the project is framed as community-owned enterprise, not a donor that we are bringing this for you for free. It is community-owned. And what we do is then we facilitate the community, then we take the lead. And that changes the entire dynamic. And the last one is talking about building stakeholder forums.
Sorry, Steve, allow me to interject a little bit. Yes. And just cut you short because I have given you an extra 5 minutes, which is fine. But I like that last point where you were addressing, now you're at revenue, now the money is coming, and it is money that is coming out of an enterprise you created. So for the audience, I would just want to probe you to have a reflection and maybe put it on the chat in reaction to Steve, and they would like to know what is that one thing that you already do that you think people would pay for, because you have heard how Steve has taken us through the journey of marginal ufanisi, water and development. So for you, as you're listening, that one thing that you're already doing, but you think people would pay for, that as you now start thinking, into enterprise. I also like something that Steve has said, and I'm a strong believer of that sustainability is not the end. Sustainability is a lived practice. It's not a theory. Most of us put together our applications, our presentations, and we say, this is a sustainability model that our organizations are going to be able to generate revenue and they will be sustainable, and then end of story. But the way he has walked us through the journey of sustainability. So let's keep also thinking about that, redefining our organizations, ask questions. We have someone who's looking at that chat group so that as we move on, we are able to address those questions. But let's see, what do you think that you're already doing that people would pay for? Thank you so much, Steve. You've shown us, what happens when we start living sustainability becomes a lived practice and not a theory. So now let's move from experimentation and go to structure. And I would be now speaking with Holly. For the next, I'll make them 12 minutes because obviously 10 are not enough. So for the next 12 minutes, Holly, I know some of our audiences right now are probably wondering, okay, alternative from grants. So feel free to mention different types of grants. Mention, not opening them, just mention, mention what they could be, those other alternative funding sources. And then from your experience, just share about a funding experiment or experience that did not go as planned. We would want to really get some wisdom out of that experience. And talk to us about how can we design financing that invites trust instead of surveillance, because most of the time organizations do feel like these questions are they're getting in my business, surveillance. And even when the money comes, how do we get into a trust space as opposed to that surveillance? And then what mindset shift do you think needs to occur even before we shift in our models? So just take it away now. Thank you.
Thanks, Wambui, and thanks everybody for joining. So just as context, in Stiglio, where I work, we really specialize in results-based financing and also wider innovative financing mechanisms at an intersection between funders, various types of funders, governments, and social enterprises, NGOs, and other implementing partners. And so I'll primarily talk through the lens of results-based financing, but can also note some other innovative mechanisms if that's helpful. So first, when we're talking about results-based financing as a potential alternative funding stream, what we really just mean is any funding where at least a portion of the funding is tied to measurable milestones, outputs, or outcomes, instead of just really focusing on reimbursing on predefined specific activities or input costs. So just in really plain language, rather than paying for a workshop being held or the number of staff hired, it looks at paying once there's verified evidence that something actually changed. The more people found stable jobs, more students are learning and learning at higher rates. Now, what's really important and to kind of dispel a common misconception on results-based financing, RBF doesn't mean that everything is tied to results, or that organizations such as social enterprises then take on all the financial risk. In many cases, there's very little of that. It's very dependent on specific design, But there's a whole spectrum of instruments within the realm of results-based financing, which have low risk transfer, or again, almost none, which almost function as almost a top-up, an additional incentive and reward for really strong outcomes. And those are usually the ones that are most effective for all parties and also the most sustainable. They create kind of the strong accountability driver without punishing innovation or punishing organizations for things that happen outside of their control. There's also a growing subset of instruments within the realm of results-based financing, which again is more of like an umbrella term itself, but there's an entire subset that are really developed for social enterprises and community-based organizations. So a very good example of this is social impact incentives, which are called SINCs, which essentially are a way for social enterprises who are also gaining revenue from the work that they're doing to have a top-up payment for the impact they're creating as well. So almost balancing the angles between a social enterprise having strong financial sustainability aims, but also needing to have that equal focus and reward on the impact side. And those function almost exclusively as an additional bonus payment to an organization, a social enterprise. So on the ground, what this really means is that a nonprofit or a social enterprise would sign an agreement that says we can achieve these specific results at this specific amount for each one of those results. And that kind of is the design process of defining what are the payment metrics, what are the targets, how would we verify this? And then very importantly, implementers then have the flexibility to adapt and change activities, to invest more in one area and less in another, as long as that's with the focus of delivering those ultimate results defined. So day to day, it's really about changing this rhythm of delivery, using more real-time data, adapting really quickly, experimenting more, and having both the funder and the implementer really aligned on what is the ultimate goal of what we're doing, and relieving a bit of the pressure on just administrative grant or contract management. So when we think about why this can be useful, especially in the context of reducing and shifting funder landscapes, again, it really is this bigger mindset. So it's moving away from just compliance as the main kind of partnership modality of compliance with the funders' various regulations, and more towards true collaboration. So it's saying, both sides need to be aligned on what we want to achieve, what results and impact we want to get to, and removing some of that burden on just a donor saying, well, this is what I want you to do, and having to comply with that. So it really shifts towards a greater relationship of trust and accountability, as some of the things you were prompting, Wambui, rather than it being about control and compliance. So really putting this ability to decide what needs to happen when in order to achieve things in the control of the implementers on the ground, who know that better than somebody sitting in the US or the UK or wherever else the funding money comes from. So it's really paying for what works, and what works decided by the organizations who know that best. So this helps to give implementing partners more flexibility. So ability to pivot as you learn, as you see more opportunities come up. It also really builds stronger performance culture. So really emphasizing data and having the space to do that, since there's less compliance data and more real focus on what results are being achieved, where can those be better. So it really kind of unlocks these strong learning, feedback, and performance loops. And often, in many cases, it also opens new financing pathways. So especially through blended finance modalities. So a lot of results-based financing becomes a blended finance structure. I'm not trying to go too much into structures and a lot of buzzy kind of terms for different instruments. I can answer questions on that if useful, but a lot of them do amount to a blended finance transaction where you're bringing in more non-traditional sources of funding who want to take on that risk, or who generally understand this concept of paying for outcomes more than they do paying for the specific activities that the big traditional aid industry sees. So you get a lot more traction with funders, corporates who want to kind of push these social good mandates, but they don't really see that coming through that traditional way that a lot of aid and donor resources have flown in the past. So I guess it would be useful to think about maybe why an organization really, what would you need in order to start experimenting with results-based financing, or more broadly, different blended finance transactions within the innovative finance space. And we often within Instiglio talk about three main pillars of readiness, and most things kind of fit within these three different pillars. So the first is having a really strong results orientation and data measurement systems. You can't really start selling or bringing funders on board on an outcomes or outputs-based nature without having the data that backs it up, either both in order for funders to really understand it, but also for an organization to ensure that they're really confident that these results can be achieved. So having a very clear, measurable theory of change where you understand what exactly are the milestones, outputs, and outcomes that your interventions or programs deliver, as well as really solid data systems to be collecting that data regularly as a basis for funding decisions and as a basis for wider engagement with innovative financing actors. That helps really just build that data you can trust and use it to again, both be ready for these type of mechanisms, design them appropriately, and also really manage performance more broadly. The second is having some of the financial and systems readiness internally. So since a results-based financing and a lot of innovative financing structures change when and how funding flows, it's very important to adjust internal financial systems to make sure that there's enough working capital or pre-financing available, and systems that can kind of deal with like different ebbs and flows in financial amounts. It's usually pretty simple, but it's very important to have that addressed. A lot of times, a very good innovative finance and results-based finance structure design accounts for a lot of that within it, but there does need to be that flexibility in internal finance admin systems to absorb a new way of funding that's very different from the past. And at the last point, which is probably the most important, is really having the organizational capacity and culture. You really need to have leaders that are championing and moving towards or have already invested in a very heavy performance culture. So one where this idea of learning and really pushing towards higher results is celebrated and is kind of the commonality within the organization. And that's really, really key. And so having that ability and that focus that permeates the leadership, the culture, all the way down to staff on the ground is very important as well. Like when we think about, and maybe one of the last points, and then I can share an example if I have time, about how kind of results-based financing can work even for smaller organizations or ones that don't feel like they're quite ready yet. There is a lot of ways, and a lot of what Instiglio has done over the years is working on results-based financing designs for smaller community-based organizations. It's done a large partnership with Global Fund, specifically targeting those type of actors as a way to build up towards what comes after Global Fund financing. And we've learned a lot in terms of the ways in which it both actually can reach better benefits for these smaller, more grassroots organizations, but how it's important to kind of reflect those different needs within how these structures get designed. And the first is really ensuring that the design reflects the needs of a specific organization. So managing the amount of risk that would get transferred, like kind of picking instruments, picking metrics that we know these organizations could deliver as a way to build up over time. The second is to really build capacity alongside financing. So when we think about experimenting with innovative and results-based financing, it's always really important to have trusted technical assistance partners there to just help along the way, to adapt some of those internal systems, to help course correct, to help really kind of make some of these performance-oriented shifts. And the third area is to as much as possible, use intermediaries or some other avenues to reduce some of the burden on the structuring. and just ensure a more stable financial flow. For example, an intermediary could be kind of taking on that risk as well in a structure. And those are some of the types of ways in which we can really make sure it works better for community-based organizations as well. And I mean, the last thing I would note is just overall, and there's a lot of different ways to think about in these tightening financial times, to think about improving the financial flows and getting kind of more stable investment. We've really seen an uptick from the funding partners we work in this interest in results-based financing, both from traditional funders as well as new ones entering the market who want to be able to actually give that flexibility to implementers, but also need to report to their own stakeholders and have that confidence that something's being delivered. And so have really seen this push towards very simple mechanisms, but ones where they're able to put that focus on results in some form or another. And with that, we'll hand it back to you, Wambui. I tried to stay in good time.
Thank you very much. You did quite well. And just a reflection on, Holly's, structure. I hope you're all, getting to understand, how we are moving. So I, for example, want to highlight some areas of convergence between Steve, who walked us through the living this, experimentation into what the structure that Holly has spoken about. So really asking as organizations, where do we have gaps in financial readiness, the systems? Do we have any of these systems? Because even as we go to seek out funding, even as now we start to diversify our funding sources, internally, how do our financial systems look like? Internally, in terms of operations, but also internally in terms of how we disperse this into, the projects that we would be directing these monies to. And I think there is also one of the biggest challenges is moving away from the one-sided compliance. I'll go back to how I started this conversation when I said that, our organizations are not having these conversations because of scarcity, So that one-sided compliance, we take responsibility for enabling this environment, allowing this to go on. So moving away from that, and you're only able to align the compliance for both sides, which would then lead to relational and trust-based relationships with funding sources or funders. If you as an organization have been able to tick some of the boxes that have been spoken about by Holly, the results orientation, very important. Are we filling applications mirrored by results? Is it internal to us or is it external, to us? And the capacity culture, let us also be bold enough to build that capacity. And there are so many avenues of building, capacity in today's world. When I listen to Holly and then I listen to Steve, and he's also gone ahead and in the inbox, he's in the chat box, he's also talked about how they shifted the funding landscape. By shifting that, it caused them to be more entrepreneurial. So even for us at TWIFund, when we have started shifting how we are looking, how we are operating as intermediaries, it is bringing in an entrepreneurial mindset. And entrepreneurial allows us to diversify our revenue streams. It allows us not to be overly dependent on grants. It allows us to even power our organization further. So he also says that helped them diversify their revenue streams. They are now performance-based. Again, performance-based comes back to this result-based financing, where we are not funding the programs, but we are funding measured activities that have measurable outcomes. So I'll ask, I don't know if I can have maybe 3 of you from the audience. If you can say if I get 2, that's fine. If I get 3, even better. What fear-based questions must you stop or must we stop asking funders? Sometimes nowadays funding comes from high net worth individuals. It comes from trust-based philanthropy. So if I at TWIFund, we are intermediaries, if you were to interact with Wambui and you have a project and you know it is ripe for funding, what fear-based question must you stop asking a TWIFund as an intermediary funder? If I can have one or two responses to that. Can I call your names? I think I will start with Tabitha Muya. You popped on my screen. What fear-based question do you think you should stop asking funders?
Fear-based question.
Yes.
Okay. Maybe I'll just bring up what I'm getting from the conversation.
Yeah.
Especially on social enterprising. Speaking from Steve's sharing, and this comes given that we are so reliant on the traditional funding, and given the way the donor landscape has shifted, and now looking at sustainability. The question is how to navigate from our traditional funding that we are very used to and also developed capacity to handle, to now shifting to the revenue-based financing that we've seen with the Maji, now Fanisi projects. So yeah, do we have the capacity for that?
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for bringing that out. And what I deduct from that, if I was a funder, the fear that you're asking is, do you have the capacity? You know, if we fill that application, will we fail or do we have the capacity? Thank you so much. Takondwa Muyasom.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
All right. So I work for an international NGO based in Malawi, and currently we've just been hit with the drought. So I've written to several banks as well as private-owned businesses to ask for meetings to see if we can collaborate in providing responses to the people who have been affected by the drought. So most of them have said yes, and I'll be starting the meetings next week. So I think the fear-based question for me would be, because I was so excited to set up these meetings, but now that the meetings have come through, I'm like, so what am I going to say? What am I going to ask? Am I going to produce the statistics and say, can you help us? Will you help us? And then if they say no, like, what's in it for us? Well, like, what is in it for the bank? So I think that's my fear-based question, that should I just say, this is the situation, the women and children are suffering, please, do you have any spare money or anything that you can spare for the marginalized? And then like, what else do I say from there? So I think that's my fear-based question. I don't know if it makes sense.
It does make sense. And yours immediately is something that is an experience that is going on. But then that, if you open it up to all our organizations, that's like your pitch. Every time you have an opportunity to apply for whatever alternative funding, you're challenged with, what will I say? I'm going to again throw that to the attendees. Please go on the inbox. Imagine your Takonda. How would you put that value proposition? Is there a value proposition when it is a humanitarian situation? Is this where you try and connect to the organization's humane side? Is this where you try and activate a CSR or an ESG? Or is it where you narrow at the services that the banks are offering that would, would be a value proposition? So feel free to respond to Takonda. I think we can revisit that as we come towards the end. But I really want to really appreciate Takonda and Muya for responding to me. And now I would want us to now get into the architecture of systems. And there would be no other person better to take us through than Ezine. So Ezine is also from Instiglio, but she will narrow it. She will bring an African perspective because she is representing the African of the organization. She'll talk about more that. But Ezine, my questions would be, if we designed a funding system based on African values, we heard Rose talk about the inherent culture that is within Africans as far as giving is concerned. We have been philanthropic from the word go, even before the word philanthropy became buzzword, we have been philanthropic. So if we designed a funding system based on African values, I know there are funding systems, but where are they, what values are they based upon? What do you think would anchor that? And where have you seen alignment between state, community, and civil society? And also open up trust-based accountability. How does that look like in practice? I know you and Holly have interacted with that, in your area of funding. So just take it away and talk to us about that.
Thank you so much, Wambe, and I'm really delighted to be on this panel today for this very timely and very relevant discussions, and acknowledging my co-panelists as well. I think this is a very interesting question. If we designed a funding system based on African values, what would anchor that? I think the first piece that I would like to sort of start with is maybe taking a step back and talking about how does funding work at the moment in Africa. When we think about like our value system, I think we have a lot of conversations, for instance, around the giving that happens in the day-to-day life of Africans. And I think I love what you mentioned when we started the conversation around if one lost their job, for instance, was it Rose that mentioned that? Yeah. If one lost their job, you go to a family friend or you go to like a family member and they'll be able to take you in and really accommodate you. And then you also have the more sort of wider or sort of larger funding and generosity that happens in the form of remittances, where people send money home to family, to friends, to colleagues, right? And I think for me, when I think about those different types of giving, I think there are other forms of giving, of course, happening as well. I think the one thing I have found that really underpins it is trust. So a classic example is if when I, as an individual, Rose, for instance, you or any of us, you would inherently go to someone that you feel comfortable and you trust, be that a family member, be that a relative. And that person feels also very comfortable supporting and providing because they trust that you are in need and that their resources is not going to waste. When you think about how we think about remittances, it's a similar sort of logic. People send money home. Sometimes they want to send it straight to the family members because they trust that that avenue will get that money across, one, but they also trust that that resource is not going to go to waste. And when we think about these two scenarios, one of the two principles that are sort of emerging are the concept of trust and efficiency. And when we look at, for instance, if we imagine a world where we designed a funding system in Africa, for instance, that could go into supporting the work that is being done by CSOs, change makers alike, I would believe very strongly that the facets of that would be focused on how can that funding be delivered or deployed in a very efficient manner, in a way that ensures that it gets to who needs it as a first step, and that is used for the right purposes, and that it gets the right results. And what makes me smile when I think about how this sort of overlaps when we think about trust-based funding and accountability is really the same premise. Right now, as CSOs, you have the conversation talking to funders around, are you able to give us more resources without basically, shining this torchlight on how many steps we've taken, how many blocks we've built? Is that the focus? When you think about that and the conversation, and I'm just talking about all through, those values and principles are emerging and recurring. The concept of trust, the concept of efficiency. And so coming to trust-based funding accountability, how would I even phrase it in my mind? I think it's very important that we realize, for instance, in Africa, that we have to start thinking very critically about what funding systems would help us to spend more efficiently. It's not about raising more money. We already are resource constrained. It's about spending well. And at Instiglio, I think a bit of what Holly talked about, we work on result-based financing. But I think why that whole logic of performance-driven financing, performance-based budgeting, or different frames or different words that it's called, would make sense in the African context. It's not just the concept of the name, no, but it's a model that inherently builds in these two principles of trust and of efficiency. Now, how does it build in trust? The first is shifting away from accountability, from compliance into accountability. And I smile whenever I think about these two things is when our funders or even us as change makers, when we talk about accountability, I find that oftentimes we're talking about compliance. We're talking about how much of our audits we've done, how much of our check, whatever boxes that we've ticked. That's not really accountability. Accountability is taking responsibility for your own performance, your own goals, and your own results. It is empowering in that sense. And so in the African landscape, that conversation of accountability needs to be inbuilt into the way every financing is spent on this continent, be it domestic financing, be it development financing. And that's the key piece of it. And that's what builds trust. Because if I don't have to chase you up all the time, I know, what you're about to achieve. More importantly, what you need to achieve, defined by your lived experience and your understanding of what is working on the ground. Then both parties or all parties are well aligned on. We have a clear destination. We give, the doers, be it service providers, be it implementing partners, the space to operate and navigate the very unique peculiarity of operating in the African context, right? Now, the second principle around why this makes sense is a principle of talking about efficiency. Now, this year, for instance, like the whole world has been agog with the conversation of how funding has been cut, the world is coming to an end, etc. And I love what you talked about when you started the conversation of us keep talking about the possibilities. And when I think about efficiency, that is thinking about possibilities. We must acknowledge to ourselves that right now, Africa is always said to have tons and tons of resources. But we also see that we also have tons and tons of challenges. And so when we think about how do we institute performance in our financing, this makes sense for us because then efficiency is about the greater and better use of our money. Take a classic case, for instance, as a government. As a government right now, even as citizens, right, when we think about the trust and the level of confidence that we sometimes have, even at the government level, there's a bit of disconnect because you're wondering, well, where is the money going to? How is the money being spent? Is it really efficient? Are we really sort of paying for the right things? Are we investing in the right sort of risk, in the right investment, or in the right product, or in the right needs of the people? And so you think about performance sort of based funding model, and you can take whatever shape or form as a key, principle or concept that inherently helps manage that efficiency and trust challenges. And I think for me, when I think about the sort of tying this all around the right-sized funding system in the African context, I don't think it's a case of funders versus government versus implementing partners, like everyone sort of calling each other out, thinking, oh, you have to be more accountable than me and the other. No. I think when we look at the way we function, we are a system, right? An ecosystem made up of different actors who collectively have to ensure that people's lives are changed in a very meaningful way. And so when we think about that way that the system functions and our very critical roles in it, and we begin to think about very carefully about how the concept of trust and efficiency applies to each one of us. I think when one is a change maker, you must ask yourself, what am I achieving? You must look yourself in the mirror and you must challenge yourself on that. And in the funding system that we find ourselves in Africa, with, before I always ask, so before you begin to ask what's the funder and the government and who are going to do, ask yourself first. Where is the trust in what I do? Where is the efficiency in what I do? Do I have a strength of conviction that if the government comes and asks me as a change maker to say, I have limited resources, I would like to be able to pay for results that I can actually, achieve? Do you have confidence in saying, yes, I'm pretty certain that the work I'm doing is changing lives on the ground, right? So I see that anchoring, when we think about anchoring, both that whether we call it trust-based funding, either as a development actor, either as a government, when we look at the African landscape as it is, we can't move forward without codifying trust in the way we spend our money, and without codifying accountability and efficiency in the way we spend our money. And I think the other element I also want to bring in, so I've mentioned two principles so far. We think about trust, we think about efficiency. The other element I want to bring in is mindset, and I love that every speaker has touched on it. At the heart of it, when we think about what makes sense for the African context, trust, etc., this requires a shift in the way we think about funding and use of funding. I think recently we've seen a few foundations begin to put in sunset clauses to the shock of many and to the mixed reactions, of the world. But I think the one thing I would ask in that context is, when we wake up each day and say, as an implementing partner, as a development partner, as a funder, as a government, I'm going to actually do X, Y, Z on the ground. What is the mindset we're going to that conversation with? Are we seeing this as a gig, as a job? Or are we seeing this that we are here to achieve a purpose? And I think when you find yourself doing the same thing over and over and over and over with no results, that is an indictment of your efforts, really. And we have to be able to look ourselves honestly in the mirror and sort of call that out, right? And then ask ourselves, okay, fine, how do we fix that? So that's why I think that mindset shift is important. A recognition, fundamentally, that we must shift away from what I have done to what I have achieved. And that is something collectively is needed for Africa to move forward. And that mindset is needed for both implementing partners, for funders, and for government, but also for us to be able to support government in a very meaningful way. Now, what do I mean? We have classic cases where some of us as change makers in the room, we have our government sort of approach us, right? They do have domestic financing. And they approach us and they ask us, well, how can I use this financing? How can I deploy this financing in a way that makes sense? And oftentimes we inherently sort of, default to, oh, well, pay us to build more schools, pay us to build more hospitals, pay us to build more things, train more young people. That's always the classic one. Train more young people. We have 1,000 young people trained as barbers. And I wonder myself, if all of us are barbers, who then will be the customer, right? And so we begin to ask ourselves, as the implementing partner, when you find yourself in that position, what should your role be? Should your role be just to add on to the existing status quo? Or should your role be to really sort of query and challenge and bring in ideas and innovations around how the funding we have, very limited, by the way, either as a domestic government or ODA, can be channeled properly? So I think as I wrap up, I think the two things that I would like us to keep in mind is, I remember I was in a panel a couple of months ago, and the speaker said something that was very striking. He said the government doesn't have exit plans, communities don't have exit plans, the private sector most times don't have exit plans. The only people who have exit plans are development actors. Yet, we are the ones in the lead. And then he says that should tell you who should lead and who should follow. And so when I wrap up, sort of think about wrapping up my reflections on this particular question, so on what should anchor our values in the Africa system to make sure that our funding is really, really relevant, I would say anchor it on trust and efficiency, because the basis upon which we as Africans are generous and show care and love to each other is because we know that that love and care is going to amount to something. And so that principle has to be translated in the way we also treat whether domestic financing in Africa or ODA financing in Africa. And we can see lots of that overlap, whether in performance-driven financing or in trust-based accountability funding, but those principles still remain. We must be able to codify trust, efficiency, and accountability in the way we spend. So I'm going to take a pause there one way. I'm not sure if I've used all my time, but I'm happy to share more as we continue.
Thank you so much. I think that was great. That was very inspiring, challenging, and it evokes a lot of thoughts. So trust, efficiency, and then that mindset shift that is important. I do not want to belabor that. We have about 2 minutes or so to go. And as I thank the panels, I would want to open at least room. I don't know, the chat does not look like there are questions. I have not seen any questions. So if you have questions, you still have some seconds to ask, but I will just take it from the top again. I will ask the panelists, give us just a sentence reflection, Rose, of everything that you would want our attendees and even yourself to take away from this. One word, how are you living this space? So I start with you, Rose, then we go to Steve, Holly, and Azine. One word. If there are any questions, please put them on the chat. You're mute, Rosie.
I said inspired and fired to continue.
Inspired and fired. Thank you, Steve. One word. You're also mute. You're also muted.
I must say I'm inspired and learned a lot. So I appreciate.
Thank you, Holly.
I agree with inspired. I would also say opportunity. I think that when crisis happens, it's often a real opportunity to change for the better, to really transform. So I think that there's a lot of potential for that right now as well. So thank you, everyone.
Azine, one word.
Thank you. It's so difficult to choose. I'm going to borrow inspired and opportunity. And I want to add purpose and possibilities. I don't know, you said one word, but I was thinking a second one. I'd like to add purpose and possibilities. I think with everything we've discussed in the room today, we can sort of see how that is very clear. Purpose and possibilities. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give Gloria Anderson an opportunity to also say one word. I acknowledge your interaction.
Thank you, Wambui. Well, it was very insightful. It's very hard to say just one word from all these bright minds and the wisdom that have released here. But what I would say for me is partnership and collaboration. The way we look at it, like all the discussions, if we gather them together and for the context of the sustainability, as you're saying, I think partnership and collaboration is what would really make our spaces and the development exit, as Azine was saying, better strategies for the future and development of the communities we serve. Yeah. Thank you, Wambui.
Thank you very much, Gloria. And thank you so much, our panelists, our attendees, catalysts now for creating this opportunity. We have come to the end of our session. At the end of our session, my LinkedIn is on the chat. Feel free to connect. And yes, thank you very much. And do have a great afternoon and weekend.
Thank you so much, Wambui. Thank you, fellow panelists.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you, our attendees.
Bye.
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 Bye.